My father was Burnham Sterling Linderman. His father was Rosco Conklin Linderman, who was born and grew up in Blandville, Kentucky. After a rather disastrous marriage, loss of a child, and a divorce, his father mounted his good horse and he rode west. And I'm not sure, but it appears that it was Kansas City, Missouri. He was riding down the street and he saw this beautiful red-headed girl sitting on a front porch of a place that had a sign that said boarding house, room for rents. So he stopped, tied up his horse, went in and got a room, and proceeded to court my grandmother. She was 16 and he was 26. But they say she was very beautiful with milk white skin, green eyes, and red hair that curled. And she had a mass of hair in those days. He was tall, handsome, dark-headed, and quite the man about town. They married, and just before grandmother was 18 years old, Dad was born. She was 18 in June of 1908, and he was born in May of 1908. Now, my grandfather had begun working in oil fields, and it's unclear to me whether he was then working as a photographer, or I'm not sure what they roustabout, maybe what they call them. Anyway, he was working in the oil fields, and grandmother was going with them, and they were in Oklahoma on their way to a job he had in Texas. And she said, Oddie, which was her nickname for him, we've got to get off the train. And he said, well, why, Violet? Why do we have to get off the train? She said, because I'm going to have the baby. And he was like, oh, we've got to get off the train. So they got off the train, they found a doctor who put her in the hospital, and they were in Muskogee, Oklahoma. He stayed with her a week after the baby was born, but in those days, they thought women weren't capable of doing anything until the baby was 2 or 3 weeks old. So he gave her money, put her in a boarding house to stay until she recovered enough, and he went on to his job in Texas. When Dad was 3 weeks old, she bought her train ticket, baby in arms, and headed to Texas to meet my grandfather. They traveled from oil field to oil field. We had a picture somewhere of them in Louisiana, of her in Louisiana, but ultimately she went back to her mother and her mother's boarding house and took Dad
Which was where?
We're not sure whether, but this time it was Kansas City or Oklahoma City, but one of those areas. Anyway, she stayed with her, and they were basically separated over some kind of a fight, and I've never known what. But anyway, grandfather was in Texas by this time, and they had an oil field fire, and oil fields were very dangerous places in those days. And her story to me said that he stepped on a rusty nail that ran right through the sole of his boot into his foot while fighting this fire. He got an infection and never could work again, and was ultimately sent by train home to Blandville, Kentucky, where his mother nursed him until his death in 1914.
Okay, so Bernie was born in Muskogee, Oklahoma, but there's not really anything else to tie us to Muskogee, Oklahoma.
No, just the fact that they were going through on a train and she was having a baby. Ultimately, while she was living in the boarding house with her mother, she met and married Rob Luke, who at the time was a traveling cattle buyer. And if you've ever watched Gunsmoke, you know, it was Dodge City, Kansas, and the cattle buyers came in when the herds came up the trails. Well, there were still traveling cattle buyers in 1914 that went from stockyard to stockyard buying cattle for the big companies that was going to slaughter them and ship them east or wherever for meat. And that's what Rob Luke did. But there was a bad economic crash of some time about then, and so he lost his job, and they moved to South Dakota, and that's where grandmother and Dad were taken. It's unclear to me, but I think it was somewhere around Rapid City. Rob Luke was very unkind to Dad. He saw him as proof that his beautiful wife had once loved and actually slept with another man, which apparently just drove him nuts. He was so cruel to Dad that he was caught chasing him through the yard, beating him with a horsewhip, and he's known to have stuck his face in the stuff in an old-fashioned outhouse. Grandmother's mother caught the old man, and he wasn't an old man at that time. He was a very handsome young man. But she caught him doing this and got a butcher knife from the kitchen and had every intention of killing him for his treatment of her grandchild. They put a stop to that, and Dad was ultimately sent to Kentucky. Now, I'm not sure which trip it was. One trip, one of the aunties took him, and another trip, he was simply put on the train with a tag around his neck and put in the care of the conductor and shipped to his grandmother in Kentucky.
His grandmother in Kentucky, who was?
His grandmother in Kentucky, who was Rosco Conklin Linderman's mother, Ellen Linderman. When she got Daddy, the first time they wanted him back, she obediently sent him back. The second time they wanted him, Dad was a great big boy of about 11 or 12. I'm not even sure how old he was, but anyway, they wanted him back because now he was big enough and strong enough and old enough to work. And it flew all over his grandmother because she knew how they had treated him, and so she sent them a telegram. You want him? Bring papers, sheriff, show up at my door to get him. They did not do that, and he stayed with her until he went voluntarily to see his South Dakota family.